who painted a very large series of haystacks in the French countryside, right, in different seasons and under different conditions of illumination, just because he was exploring how radically different the same object could be as it moved through contexts. And so it isn't even obvious why we think this is the same object when you move it. And the answer is something like, well, you can sit on it in both positions, which is not a description of an object, by the way, right? That's a description of something that's useful, something that's a tool, something that exists in relationship to your body. It's not an object. And so if you think that just looking at something like a chair is almost impossibly difficult and subject to interpretation, then imagine how difficult it is to perceive something like a text, you know, like a novel, because a novel obviously is subject to multiple interpretations, and the interpretations are going to depend on, well, at least in principle, on the intent, conscious and unconscious of the author, of the time, of the place, of the culture, of the language. Then that's just on the side of the production itself, but then there's the reader. It's like, I've read books when I was 16 and then reread them, say, when I was 40, and the book was almost completely different as far as I was concerned, partly because I knew what was in it the second time and I didn't know what was in it the first time. And so the meaning that manifests itself out of a book is a consequence of all the complexity of the book plus all the complexity of the reader. And so, you know, if you're reading Russian literature, for example, and you've already read 50 Russian novels, you're going to be in a much more you're going to be in a different interpretive space than you are if, say, the Russian novel is the first novel you've ever read. And the postmodernists were grappling with this, as well as with many other ideas that I think contaminated their thinking. And their conclusion was, well, you can't extract out a canonical meaning from a text. It's so dependent on the situation that to say the text has a interpretable meaning is actually an error. Now, just because it's difficult to do something doesn't mean it's impossible. And there's massive holes in the postmodernist view, as far as I think it's an unbelievably pathological view personally. But the thing is that there are reasons why it emerged, and the reasons were analogous to the reasons that the AI project initially failed, and analogous to the reasons that this experiment turned out the way it did. So I'm going to show you this. Many of you have seen this already, but as I said, it doesn't matter. So your job here is to count the time. You see, there's a team of 3 people here dressed in white, and there's a team of 3 people here dressed in black. And your job is to count the number of times the white team throws the basketball back and forth to the white team members, okay? So we'll just run that. Okay, well, so obviously, or perhaps not so obviously, the number of times I believe that they threw it back and forth was 16, if I remember this correctly. But of course, that's not really the issue, because what happens in the middle of the scene is that a guy wearing a gorilla suit comes out into the middle of the screen and pounds his chest 3 or 4 times, and he comes out quite slowly, as you saw. How many of you? Is there anybody here who didn't see the gorilla? No, well, and I presume all of you knew about this video anyways. So Dan Simon, who produced this video, has got a couple of other ones where he shows that, you know, even if you're smart enough to see the gorilla, because you've seen the video before, you've heard about it, if you make other changes in the background, you'll count properly and you'll catch the gorilla, but you'll miss the other changes in the background. And they're not trivial either. And it's really quite remarkable. He's produced other short videos, for example, where you'll be looking at a field, and a road will grow in it, occupying about 1/3 of the photograph space, and you'd think, well, yeah, you're going to see that. It's like, you don't. So, okay, so this threw a big spanner into the works, this sort of experiment, along with the AI failures, and we could even say the postmodern dilemma. It's like, well, virtually every psychologist would have predicted before this series of experiments that there's no damn way you'd miss that gorilla, because your nervous system was actually attuned to change in the environment, and like that's a big change, and it's also a gorilla. It's something you would really think that you couldn't miss, you couldn't possibly miss, especially when it's occupying the center of the visual field. And so, well, this is part of a phenomena called change blindness, and it helped psychologists who had been studying the visual system for a very long time figure out, well, mostly figure out exactly how blind human beings are, because we're way blinder than we think. And so we actually focus on much less of the world than we think. And we do that partly, it's not exactly obvious how we do it. It's kind of like we hold a still picture in our imagination and then fill in the details by using our central foveal vision, which is always dancing around like a pinpoint or a laser beam, moving back and forth, and we're assembling those little snapshots from the fovea into a relatively coherent picture. Maybe what happens is that I look at you, and then I look at you, and I've still got the information from looking at you, so my brain can sort of infer that's remained stable. But like if I look at you and I pay it, I've tried to learn how to do this, because you can look at something and then pay attention to the periphery. It's annoying, but so if I'm looking at you, I really can't make out your eyes. I can more or less make out the fact that you have a head. I can see that you're, and especially if you move it, and so that's what your periphery is sort of like frog vision or dinosaur vision. It's much better at picking up movement than it is at picking up something that's staying still, and that makes sense because, well, if it's staying still then, and it hasn't already hurt you, then it's probably not going to hurt you. But if it's moving, then you know that's a good thing that you might pay attention to. And so if your periphery catches movement, then you'll focus your fovea on it. It's like you go from really low resolution to really high resolution. And so the center of your vision is incredibly high resolution, but then it fades into low resolution as you move towards the periphery until it's out here, which would say be about 170 degrees. If I concentrate on this hand, I can tell it's a hand mostly when it's moving. I have no idea what color it is. This one I can't see at all. And then I can probably see my fingers now. And then I can clearly see them if I look at them with my fovea. And so your vision is a very, very strange thing, and it's focusing on something very specific. And so you're pointing your eyes at something very specific, and that's what you seem to see. And so then that opens up a whole new universe of questions. It's like, how do you decide what to point your eyes at? That turns out to be an insanely complicated problem. John Vervaeke talks about that all the time as the problem of relevance. And the issue is, well, there's many things in the world. There's an infinite number of things, let's say, and you're not going to be able to see them, that's for sure, even if they happen to be changing, as it turns out. And so out of this mess, first of all, how do you pick what to look at? And second, even if you do pick it, how do you see it? Because it's so crazily complicated. So that's the problem that we're going to try to unpack. Now, roughly speaking, what seems to have happened with the gorilla video is you have to take that first theory that you make a complete model of the world, and then a complete model of the world which is the objects in the world and how they're interacting, and you compare that to the objects in the actual world and how they're interacting. You have to modify that model. You say, well, no, you're certainly not making a complete model. And people should have known better anyways, even subjects to the limits of your perceptions, because there's all sorts of things in the world that you can't directly perceive. But what you're doing instead is, it's something like you're making a partial model of the world, but you're only making a partial model of the world that you're currently operating on with some goal in mind, and you're also comparing that to a model of the world as it's currently unfolding. Because the other thing that was implicit, this is really tricky, this is where you have to watch your implicit assumptions. The other thing that was implicit in the original cybernetic theory was that you have a model of the world that's complete, and then what you're watching is the actual world as it unfolds. And that's not a model. That's just your perception of the objects. But that also turns out to be wrong, because your perception of the world as it unfolds is also a model. And so what's happening is you look at the world you see is a model, and a very partial model at that, and then you compare it to the model that you expect or desire, more accurately, although the initial models were expectation. Because if you're in the lab listening to tones, it's not like you desire anything, but mostly when you're acting in the world, you have desires, and so the experimental constraints skewed the data in some sense by making people assume that what people were doing when they walked through the world was expecting instead of desiring. Anyways, you have a model of the world that's generated as you look at it. You have another model of the world that's something like the world that you desire. Then you compare both of them, and they can mismatch, and they can mismatch in a way that upsets your current pursuit. That's the critical issue. You don't see the anomaly unless it upsets your current pursuit. And you kind of know that too, because when you're, like, while I'm lecturing to you guys, you know, mostly you're sitting still, but people are moving their arms, and they're moving their glasses, and they're shifting their feet, and generally I don't see any of that, because what difference does it make? You know, as it's not relevant to the ongoing what? Ongoing contract, the ongoing series of interactions. It's something like that. So as long as you keep your movements bounded within a range that doesn't interfere with whatever it is that we're doing, then it's going to be as invisible to me as the gorilla was when you were counting the balls. And the cool thing is about the gorilla experiment, or one of them, is that the reason you were blind to the gorilla was because you were counting the balls. And so that's so fascinating, because what it shows to a huge degree, an unfathomable degree, an unfathomable degree, is that the value structure that you inhabit determines what you perceive. It doesn't just determine what you expect or want. It bloody well determines what you see. And that makes the world a completely different place. No one really expected that. And so if you watch the basketballs, you see the basketball. If you stop watching the basketball, well, then you see the gorilla. And so the first question that arises from an experiment like that is, well, just exactly what is it that you don't see in the world? And the answer is all of it. You see so little, it's unbelievable. You see that tiny amount that's necessary for you to undertake the next sequence in your plotted movements, something like that. But then that becomes very complicated too, because it isn't obvious how you can conceptualize or how you can determine what your next movement is, because it's not like you just add up movements and make up your life. It's not that simple, and it's related to the novel problem, the problem of meaning in a literary work. So you imagine you're trying to specify the meaning of a literary work. Well, there's meaning in the word, but the meaning of the word is dependent on the phrase within which it's embedded. And then the meaning of the phrase is dependent on the sentence that it's embedded in, and the sentence in the paragraph, and the paragraph in the chapter, and the chapter in the book, and the book in the corpus of books of that sort, and then within the culture, and then within whatever your peculiar personal experience is. All of those things nested are operative to some degree when you're extracting out the meaning at any level of analysis. They're all operating simultaneously. And so you might say, well, what are you doing in this classroom? Well, the answer is sitting in a chair. But that's a very short-term and context-independent answer. But you're also attending to what I'm saying, hypothetically, and you're attending to some of it and not to other parts of it. And you're thinking about some parts of it and not other parts. And you're also attending a class, and the class is a sequence of lectures, and that's embedded within your desire to finish up the semester, and then to finish up the year, and then to get your degree, and then you nest that inside whatever it is, whatever the reason is that you're getting your degree. And then maybe that's nested inside your career goals, and that's nested inside your life goals, and that's nested inside your ultimate values, which you may or may not even be aware of. And so I could say, well, you're sitting here because it serves your ultimate values. Well, that's true. It seems a bit abstract to be useful, right? It gets so vague out at the outermost levels that it doesn't really have much specificity, right? So it seems to lack information. But by the same token, if I said what you're doing is sitting there, it has the same problem of too restricted meaning because of over-specificity. And so there's some level in there that you would interpret as meaningful. God only knows why. And that's the level there's a natural level of perception for that sort of thing. So for example, when children learn